Hello there, it's Jim here, and if my voice sounds a little bit strange or strained, it's because I'm fighting off a little bit of a cold, so please bear with me if possible.
We demand that you return our crew member immediately.
Request denied.
And so in my last video, I ended on this panel, and I hinted at the ramifications that this panel basically holds for the entire One Piece story as a whole, and the secrets hidden inside of it is what we're going to be exploring in the rest of this video. Because like always, when it comes to the genius of Oda, he presents you with something extremely simple, but the meanings and intentions behind it are galaxy altering, and in this case, narrative altering. But as you'll see in this video, not so much, because this kind of story that's being set up has been set up literally since chapter 1, and I'll be able to show you that in much more detail coming up. And so on the surface in this panel, we get Guinea describing the prizes of this God Valley hunting tournament, where she says that one of the prizes is the devil fruit that will allow you to transform into the Azure Dragon, and then another prize contained in this God Valley tournament is the Pawpaw fruit, which can be used to blast yourself and others to distant islands. And to demonstrate these fruits, Oda has drawn in the background a image of a dragon and a cat with a paw covering its right eye. And so, as I said, on the surface, extremely simple. Not much here, right? Of course, that is not at all the case. I want to start with talking about this cat for the pawpaw fruit. And I think it's very important to note that for this pawpaw fruit illustration, you have a cat, which throughout the story so far, the pawpaw fruit has been represented by a bear-like creature. Of course, Kuma has the famous bear ears on top of his head, as well as the name Kuma, meaning bear in Japanese. Which, if you've seen other videos of mine, you'll know that the name Arthur of King Arthur actually originally meant bear, which I will get to in other videos. But for now, just knowing that the bear being a king-like representation is a huge, huge trope throughout media. Isn't it also a little bit peculiar how the first time that we've seen Kuma before Wano and all these newest flashbacks, he seems to have a number of Excalibur-like swords stabbed into his body while being ridden by a pseudo-dragon. I think all kind of hinting to the idea that in the One Piece world currently right now, the sea dragon, sea serpent has beaten the sun cat, thunder god. But of course, here, that representation is replaced by that of what looks to be a cat.
You owe me something. You do realize that, don't you? I'm a woman. I haven't had the comfort of a husband, a man.
Not now, Doctor. Please.
And now, of course, here's the point in the video where I think it's very important to mention that this pose that this cat is in during this panel is the same exact pose that Gear 4th bound man Luffy takes, as well as those Nika golden statues in Skypiea. And I do think that it's very important to note that whenever Oda draws cats, he seems to always draw 3 whiskers, which, like everything on the surface, doesn't really sound like much, except when you take into account the fact that the scar below Luffy's eyes is always drawn with 3 lines, the very same 3 whiskers. But I will touch on this much more when we circle back to chapter 1, and how this panel pertains to exactly what happens at the end of chapter 1. Now, I know what you may be asking yourself. Why is this important? Why is a cat against a dragon important? Well, it's one of the most symbolic representations of good and evil, light versus dark, etc. in ancient Egyptian mythology. I've had other videos where I talk about the ramifications that the Atep or Apophis god in Egyptian mythology holds within the One Piece story, and one of the most famous renditions of the fight of the sun god Ra versus this giant serpent Atep in Egyptian mythology is actually when Ra takes on the form of a giant sun cat. And now, in this panel, obviously something's going on because the cat has its right eye covered. Now, the right eye in Egyptian mythology normally represents the eye of Ra, which was the sun eye, and it was the eye where Ra held the majority of his godly and majestic sun powers. And aside from the right eye of Ra relating to the sun, it also inhibits protective powers that come from instilling fear of violence. Now, in this image, we're shown the left eye, which I believe relates to the Eye of Horus, which is related to the moon in Egyptian mythology. And those powers are protective powers that come from deflecting malevolent forces. Now, deflecting forces and pain and sickness and illness and all of those things seem to be very congruent with the powers of the pawpaw fruit that we have seen exhibited in the story so far. Which I believe makes a ton of sense because in all of Egyptian mythology, when Ra takes out his right eye and uses it to punish humanity and uses it to unleash his vengeance and judgment on humanity, it is always represented by a female goddess. A female goddess that inhibits the powers of Ra and the sun. And I believe in the One Piece story, that's very literal because I believe that that embodiment of the sun's energy is actually Nami. And before you turn off the video because that sounds super crazy and outlandish, I'd like to take you through the etymology that relates to paw. And before we get into the paw word further, I want to point out that every single time this embodiment of Ra in a female form on Earth is taking vengeance and destroying all of humanity, it is always stopped by getting the girl drunk, getting her wasted on red wine because they think it's blood, which I think ties in extremely to the idea of Binks sake or Binks brew being an endgame thing. I don't at all agree with the idea that it's a party and all these things, but I do agree with the idea that it's used to pretty much booze up and drunkify a goddess who is set on destroying the world. Now, we all know what a paw is, and that it is a, expenditure of an animal. Its feet, its hands, its claws, all of those being paws. But another definition of paw is actually the hand. And when you look into etymology and the actual formation of letters and words and those type of things, the majority of letters start, and alphabets start with representing the hand of a human and the palm of a human. For instance, this shape that I'm making with my hand looks like a lowercase a if you were to look at it from your eye's point of view into your hand. But it also encompasses your entire palm and hand. And actually, when it comes to these very old languages, it's amazing to me how much the first letters of them are usually dictated by the idea of what your hand looks like while holding a pen while writing. All of those things originally meant palm, and palm meaning paw in some form, I think is a very real thing. But where it gets extremely interesting is when we play around with that word paw and we flip it backwards, which on my channel, that's one of the major kind of rules I have, that clues and words have to work backwards and forwards, just like the Grand Line and Roger's Journey on it.
Let's at least pretend we got a fucking clue.
And when we reverse the word paw, we get wop or wap. And no, I'm not talking about the Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion song. But so when it comes to the word wap, we get a couple different definitions. The first one being a blow or beating. We also get a weapon or a gun, which in chapter 1, we get Shanks very disheartened by the idea that Luffy only wants to be as strong as a pistol or firearm shot with his punch. But I think the biggest definition that holds a clue to all of this with the WAP word is its meaning of being abreast. Now, when we look at the very first page of the manga, we get Roger, and when he's talking about the One Piece and his treasure, when we use a little bit of light magic, the One Piece treasure word bubble lines up exactly with Nami's breasts. And I think that on one hand, that is all a clue to the idea that Nami is actually this embodiment of the sun energy Ra. Whether that is leading Luffy to destroy the current world order and establish a new sort of direction and ideal for the world, or if it's Nami quite literally being this godly being that inhibits a lot of powers that are hidden within her that she doesn't know about, but throughout the manga she exhibits weather control and hockey control and yada yada yada, all of these things. And I think a very big kind of tie into that is that actually since 1611 WAP has actually meant to engage in sexual intercourse, which is actually the definition of the name Roger, to engage in sexual intercourse. And what's really super interesting about that WAP world, meaning to engage in sexual intercourse, is that the first attestation of that vocabulary is in Thomas Middleton's 1611 book, The Roaring Girl, which the editor, Arthur Henry Bullen, attests to. Now, I think that there's lots of things with the roaring girl and the roar of a lion and sun lion and God, as well as the Arthur name coming back in with the true king, all that stuff being very prevalent in all of these things. And as I've said before in numerous videos, I do believe that people like George R. Martin and Ichiro Oda, their favorite book is actually the dictionary. And reading up all of these etymologies and meanings and histories behind various words that we use in everyday life that we have no idea its various connections and immense ramifications and webs that tie to things that we would never think about otherwise. And if I had to guess exactly what this light magic first panel where Roger says I left all my treasure in one place and it shows Nami's boobs in the background, I'd say that it's probably because Joy Boy or whoever was the originator of the One Piece treasure that the Roger pirates found, I'd guess that however they moved that treasure and hid it somewhere was using the pawpaw fruit. I know that all this Nami, Ra, sun god, eye stuff is going to be very abrasive to a lot of viewers and readers of the One Piece manga, but
Stop it. Get some help.
I believe that Oda's kind of been hinting at this stuff since the very, very beginning. And one of the biggest clues to it, I think, is actually the cover of chapter 24, which is the things that you can't lie about. And in this cover, we get Nami eating an apple, I think very clearly a sign of Eve eating the apple after beating up a huge, gigantic snake. And actually, to take this cover one step further, Nami has beaten up this gigantic snake, presumably because it was trying to eat these baby birds that were in a nest. And of course, where do you usually find birds' nests? In trees. Well, I believe that's actually all a clue to Norse mythology and the myth that at the end of Ragnarok, the only two survivors were Lif and Lifpersir, and that the two would hide in the wood of Hadmimis Holt, and that through the two of them, they would rebuild humanity, and that from them generations will spring. And all of this kind of tying into the idea that the sun god takes on a giant snake dragon Leviathan, which is, from the very beginning of this video, this panel, the other half of this extremely loaded panel is this paw cat god looking thing fighting against a azure dragon. Now, the azure dragon, meaning blue dragon, I think is a very clear reference to a water dragon or a water serpent, or as many myths and religions account to, a sea dragon versus a type of thunder god. But before we move on to the final part of this video, we have to address the elephant or the emu in the room. And by that I mean the last part of this most loaded panel Oda has ever drawn, which is this Den Mushi that Guinea is holding. Now, on this very same page, we get two panels on the top in the corner where the Den Mushi is equated straight up to Mary Joa. And in the story itself, and in the story proper, it's because it's this Den Mushi showing the events of God Valley to the people of Mary Joa. But I think, like everything Oda does, it is much more loaded than that. And I think that this Den Mushi is actually the equivalent here of Emu, and Emu's ever-seeing eavesdropping ability of being able to monitor essentially the entire world. And now, why exactly is that? Is Emu a person or creature that is a snail? I don't think so much, but I do think the idea of snails getting new shells as they get bigger and older is essentially what Emu has been doing for hundreds of years in body snatching. And I've had other videos where I think that Emu herself has actually been body snatched by others, but for just this video, to keep it short and simple, I think that the idea that this snail-like creature that is able to hear and see around the world, essentially eavesdrop, the Eve fruit, which is what I think that Emu has, and one of its main powers being eavesdropping, I think is one huge aspect to all of this. But I think that just the idea that Emu and the crown itself is a husk or a shell that various people throughout time have worn and switched around and stolen, I think that that's the main clue here with this Den Mushi Mary Joa comparison and equation. And perhaps the idea that the holy land of the One Piece world is constantly in flux. And yes, for a bunch of time in the recent history of the One Piece world, it's been Mary Joa. But I believe that this holy land has been other places and other things many times throughout the One Piece world. And of course, I think that the empty throne itself could actually be the shell or husk that this snail represents. But now, without further ado, let's end this video talking about this azure dragon or blue water serpent.
I'm not gonna lie to you. It's gonna get weird. Two dragons.
And now, I would like to point your attention to Chapter 1 of the One Piece manga, and the very end, where Luffy demolishes the Sea King that is around Windmill Island. Now, on the surface, this is just Luffy, in part taking revenge for Shanks' missing arm, and also proving that he's strong enough to move on from this section of the narrative. But on a very visceral level, this is a thunder god versus a sea serpent. I think Luffy, with his rubber powers and being a natural insulator for thunder and lightning, I think is all kind of encompassing the idea that Luffy is a type of thunder god, or Thor's hammer in a way, in which he is able to kind of direct and dictate and control lightning by being thunder, as we see in Skypiea and various things with lightning. And he takes on a water dragon, or a sea serpent, which is what the King of the Coast is in Chapter 1. And so, as I said, we get tons of ideas and clues and hints to Luffy being a type of Ra slash sun slash thunder god. He takes on Kuro, who is the black cat, whereas Luffy is the golden cat. He takes on Arlong, who is the fish, shark, water dragon. Next we have Luffy taking on Crocodile, which a crocodile is actually one of the forms that Apep takes in Egyptian mythology, this giant snake creature taking on the sun god, and essentially the embodiment of evil in the form of a crocodile taking on the sun cat itself. We get Luffy taking on Enel, which is the lightning and thunder god, and Luffy very easily overpowers him and basically dismantles his entire being. We get Luffy then taking on in Water 7 and Enies Lobby Rob Lucci, which is the Jaguar god, which is a huge Mesopotamia and Mayan myth and illustration of the idea of a cat god. And then, jump ahead of, a few hundred chapters, and we obviously get Luffy taking on Kaido, who is this embodiment of the blue sea serpent. And I would like to point out that Kaido's fruit is the fish fruit. And I think all of that kind of ties back into this idea that it is a sea serpent or sea dragon, and not just a dragon that flies around in the air, but that there is some connection to the sea with this devil fruit. And then Ryuga Palace with Fishman Island, and this idea that the dragon connects to the water and the sea. And I think that all of that ties into this ever-expanding myth throughout all of time, throughout all of civilization, thousands and hundreds and thousands of millions of years of human civilization on Earth, with the idea that a thunder god or someone who encapsulates the power of thunder taking on the power of the sea in the form of a dragon.
You figure it's all a scam, huh?
Mm.
All them folks?
Mm-hmm.
They just wrong?
Oh, yeah. Been that way since one monkey looked at the sun and told the other monkey, he said, for you to give me your fucking share. People so goddamn frail, they'd rather put a coin in a wishing well than buy dinner.
Jesus. And I think it's very important to note here that thunder is not an actual thing, but the sound that lightning makes. And this sound idea tying back into Luffy's drums of liberation and the ties to Nika and all of these things being sound oriented, I think is a very, very big deal. And that is, of course, exactly what I'm going to touch on in my next video, where it comes down to Luffy being the newest incarnation or clone of Uranus, the Sky Father himself. As always, if you watched this long, I thank you so much. Please leave a comment below about what you think about every crazy thing I've said. My name is Amjin Rakai. I thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you all in the next vid, where we kind of discuss and break down how Luffy is, in fact, the Sky Father of the One Piece world. Thank you so much. My name is Amjin Rakai. Bye-bye.